Welcome to Tone Talk. How's everybody doing today? This is Attorney Antonio Moore coming to you today to have a discussion about Donald Trump releasing new data that shows that the black unemployment rate has reached a low of 6.8%, lowest that we've seen in decades supposedly, and it just has some merit. It has a bunch of flaws in it. I think that one of the dangers of him releasing this data is it's really a cover to allow for him to essentially cut budgets, slash taxes, and justify a plan that's already in place to gut the services that the poor need by saying there's not that many poor. When in reality, when you cut this thing open, nothing about that number is accurate. 6.8% is highly inaccurate, and I'm gonna show you why. But essentially, I want you just to follow that unemployment number that he's showing makes no sense. So they give you this number and you gotta wonder where it comes from. I wanna share that first. Early each month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS of the U.S. Department of Labor, announces the total number of employed and unemployed people in the United States for the previous month, along with many of their characteristics. These figures, particularly the unemployment rate, tell you the percentage of labor force that's unemployed. The problem is they don't get out in the community to get this data. This is kind of like a raw number kind of thing. And none of that is telling about a black community that's largely economically blighted and underclass. When you have an underclass, you gotta get out in the community because there's a lot of people that you gotta ask questions of to really get raw data. When we see an example of that, what we see is extremely high numbers. What do I mean? Well, the U.S. Census recently, and when I say recently, within the last few years, the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey, they gather data, and their data doesn't line up with Trump's at all. There was an article written, I'm pulling it up now, based on that data called "The Jobless Rate for Young Black Men is a National Disgrace." I want to share a section with you and then give you an explanation of how I see that fitting. Between 2010 and 2014, Milwaukee's average rate of black joblessness was 54%, compared to rates of only 17 and 26% respectively among the city's white and Latino young male populations. The U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey gathered data on the jobless rate of non-institutionalized men, meaning the ones that weren't incarcerated, ages 20 to 34, over the period of 2010 to 2014 for 34 major cities. The data paints a grim picture for black men, particularly in Midwestern industrial and mid-Atlantic cities like Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and D.C. All of these cities have black jobless rates above 45%. So Donald Trump wants us to believe that in less than a few years, with negligible, if any, policies done to correct it, that this unemployment rate went from 45% to 6%. I don't think you understand that right now there's a whole battle going on, and that battle is to paint a picture that the poor don't need services. The poor are in your family. The poor are part of your community. And I think when I look at this thing, it's a disgrace that he came out with that number. It's a disgrace because the number is actually so highly inaccurate, and I'm going to show you why. So when I start to look at this thing, I can't help but kind of first acknowledge that the unemployment rate is typically twice as high for black folk. Even today with this number that he released, twice as high. But when you start looking at the factors of what they're doing to boost the numbers, it's even more atrocious. It's even more insidious. You first have this reality. I'm pulling up an article now, just started in May of 2017, that you're going to count Uber. You're going to count Uber and Lyft as employed. I know people got to do that to survive. I don't necessarily believe Uber is correct. I believe it never should have existed. I believe it's a shirking of 100 years of labor laws. But what you see is that people that are not really in a job, they're in this ad hoc kind of fill-in job, are now being counted in labor to kind of boost the numbers of who isn't unemployed. Those people are unemployed. They don't have no health insurance. They don't have no basic protections of employment, unionization. What we have right now is a shirking of responsibility for why we needed Uber to exist. And I think when you start to look at this thing, for them to include Uber and Lyft and all of these little patchwork jobs that don't support families inside of the numbers to get you to 6% is a problem, and you should be livid. The other thing that I see is that they essentially are not counting prisoners. Now, normally in a functional society, not counting prisoners doesn't altogether matter all that much. And even here, for many subgroups, from white women to African American women to Asians, it doesn't matter because they don't really go to jail like that in high ratios. The white female incarceration ratio, I think, is below 100 per 100,000, and for black women, I think it's below 300 per 100,000. It might even be below 200 now per 100,000, which is really small, in ratio. Now, for black males ages 20 to about 40, that incarceration rate is well above 7,000 per 100,000. It's well above 7,000, and if you add in the probationers, you're probably talking about 15,000 per 100,000. 15% of the group. Now the problem is that they don't count prisoners in unemployment data. So you're not going to count that 10% of the group is unemployed, of the working age group don't have a job. Or for that matter, 10% of the working age group are in these prisons working for a quarter an hour. Which should be included in the data to give you the real rate of wage earnings for, say, African American men. If you got numbers that high, you got to include it. You got to include it so we can see what's going on. And I think that, you start to look at everyone from Kamala Harris, who was the Attorney General here in California, and hired black prisoners along with others to fight fires for nickels and dimes. And you got to question, how did we get here to a place where we don't want to see the reality of the condition of black life? We just want a fantasy. And I feel the danger of it all is that we get to a place where we don't understand. We don't understand the reality of what race is in America, and how race paints a picture that isn't pretty, and how that it only became borderline pretty in a way through fighting every day for rights and for access. So what essentially I wanted to share with you, going back to that incarceration, is that Becky Pettit, a sociology professor at the University of Texas, what she said is that excluding prisoners means that the federal unemployment numbers overstate the economic well-being of the American population and understate racial inequality. Basic math. If you have a group that's incarcerated at a rate of less than 0.5%, not counting those people as unemployed doesn't really affect the number. So you can say, I don't count prisoners, they're sample negligible. But when a group is 15% incarcerated between parole and actually being behind bars, you got to count that group, that number, especially if that's the working age men. Come on, man. The third thing that's cut out, and I'm going to pull up a picture of a young black male that was sent to me only during Christmas, that not a felon, hardworking young man, and he just can't find work. There's a bunch of people been applying to Subway, McDonald's, and everywhere else, and can't find work. Between globalization, immigration, a large amount of mechanization, the amount of jobs out there is shrinking. It's shrinking at a time where people need jobs to support themselves and their families. So by not looking, they get shut out in terms of not being unemployed. They're just not counted, just like the prisoners. You start to realize that 6.8% ain't real at all. Don't go out and trumpet that 6.8%. Don't go out there and use no Cosby-esque exceptionalism to try to make people feel bad and say you're not looking for work. That's why you're not working. It's out here. Because it isn't. That's just the data. And so, so much of this breaks down to a nation that is afraid to confront the realities of how race and the vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow have left a scar that digs to the very heart of this place. There's 3 factors, according to one article, that kind of show why there's such a gap in employment rates. One of them is an extreme discrepancy in the amount of education between the groups, between blacks and whites. Extremely high amounts of ratio. I think about 20% of blacks have an advanced undergraduate degree, whereas 37% of whites do. The second is mass incarceration, which I just covered. I mean, the lasting impacts of mass incarceration will rivet throughout the entirety of all of our lives. It was devastating what they did here. And somebody would say, well, didn't those young men do crimes? No, that's not what happened. Hold up, because opioids ain't punished the way that crack was. This was a decision to deal with a group that essentially came out of slavery and shuffle them away instead of dealing with the reality of them having economic light as a result of policies like Reaganomics and trickle down, policies like Donald Trump's tax reform, which will bring about a whole new form of secondary status for a lot of black folk and a lot of other folk as well. The last thing is outright discrimination. The reality of privilege of whiteness is going to show up now in a whole new way. It's been showing up, but it's going to get bad. And when I say that, I mean there's the wealth of money, and then there's also the wealth of social acceptance. And what you're going to see is that outright discrimination. I choose him over him for whatever reason. He came from the same country as me. He has the same lineage as me. He looks like me. He makes me feel comfortable. It's going to get real, and it's been real in the workplace. And that's part of the reason that we have such a gap. Outright discrimination. It's not a question. So reading this article called The Mystery of High Unemployment Rates for Black Americans, the third possible explanation is outright discrimination. One study in 2004 provided strong evidence that racism among employers is at least partly to blame. The authors responded to help wanted advertisements in newspapers in Boston and Chicago with fake resumes. They gave names common to black Americans to some fictitious applicants and names common to whites to the rest. Every other detail was identical. Sure enough, the candidates were stereotypically white names received 50% more job interviews. 50% more job interviews. This is a significant issue. Ain't no 6.8% unemployment rate given by Donald Trump gonna fix that. We here to have this discussion, to get the dialogue going, to understand that we have a significant issue, that we have an issue of unemployment like we haven't seen in a long time. Counting Uber drivers, ignoring the incarcerated, ignoring those that have left the market, isn't gonna fix that. We gotta confront it, look in the mirror, and demand better policy from these politicians and our government. This is Tone Talks. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. Please go to tonetalks.org to subscribe and donate. Let's keep this discussion going, and let's hold everybody accountable.